The following episode is sponsored by War to Glory. The Germans were not the initial submarine pioneers, though they were the ones during this war that made the most use of subs throughout the Atlantic Ocean, even far from the war zone. That's what I'll look at today. I'm Indy Nidell. Welcome to a Great War special episode about German submarine warfare and the First World War. During the Great War, the submarine came of age as the warring powers realized its value against enemy shipping, and they became more effective and deadly as the war dragged on. They attacked their victims while surfaced or submerged with torpedoes, laid minefields, shelled their enemies with deck guns, or boarded them to destroy their ships with explosives. Surface attacks were usually preferable since a periscope gave an extremely limited view of above, and they were slower underwater, and that could cause them to lose their prey. Submarines were imperfect weapons, though. They were prone to breakdown, and they had some of the worst possible living conditions for a sailor. One improvement that at least helped with the breakdowns and gave them more speed was a two-shaft drive. This gave a backup propeller and more power overall. As for living conditions, everything was small and cramped, and the kerosene and gas engines used in the early parts of the war caused terrible smoke and fumes, leading to a lot of sick personnel. Hygiene could not be maintained on patrol, and sickness and lice quickly spread. The temperatures were awful, and blowtorches were even used to cook on those subs without stoves. However, because of this closeness and the shared hardship of danger, and because there was no room for men who could not be relied on, a U-boat's complement was a uniquely tight brotherhood. We were like a great family isolated on the wastes of the ocean. Many, though, died horrible deaths in their iron coffin, sometimes waiting for hours for death to come, trapped on the bottom of the sea, sometimes hastening its end. In January 1916, though, the Kaiser laid out a comprehensive plan for the German U-boat war against the British. Mine layers would operate close to Britain itself, while attack subs would disrupt shipping far off at the approaches to the British Isles. The Germans were now using the subs with some thought of specifically winning the war at sea. In 1916, sinkings were up 29%, and the Allies began arming their merchant ships. Side note here, only in the 20th century were the sea lanes safe enough that merchant ships ceased to be armed. By February 1917, the German Navy had 111 operational U-boats, half the number they had predicted necessary to strangle British trade. As we've seen in our regular episodes, that spring, the Allies instituted the convoy system for their shipping to stymie the U-boats, and by the summer, the U-boats had been forced to widen their patrol areas to find prey. The reason for this is that convoys denuded the seas of single ships, and though a convoy was a larger target, it was way more likely to slip through patrol areas since it took up a relatively smaller chunk of ocean than a bunch of single ships on different approach vectors. German orders for new and different types of U-boats were then put aside to fit the changing conditions. The smaller and easier to build coastal U-boats were clearly favored for economy and the changing situation. Over the course of the war, then, under a quarter of all German U-boats built were the larger ocean-going attack ones. So convoy won the day on the open seas. By 1918, U-boat attacks were much more often against coastal shipping. Also, a majority of attacks were now by night because of things like aerial patrols of coastal waters. The altiscope, an angled periscope, was fitted to subs in 1918 to help spot danger from above. Planes weren't much good at actually sinking subs at this point, but they could force them underwater and away from merchant vessels, and of course, warn of their presence. By this time, the German sub program was hampered by acute shortages of supplies and skilled labor. In August 1917, they had all naval yards give precedence to submarines over surface ships. Despite this, mechanical problems on U-boats were common, and were mainly because of lack of supplies of the right parts, and those suppliers had technical and labor shortages. The lack of riveters and caulkers slowed production. They only had 145,000 of the 185,000 riveters needed to keep up the pace, and there were more and more strikes and absenteeism. By 1918, there were food shortages, and the Spanish flu also seriously affected production. Now, the Germans never learned how to defeat a convoy in the war, but they did come dangerously close. For example, on July 19, 1918, convoy OLX-39 was off the west coast of Scotland. It had 7 ships, including the huge White Star liner Justicia, and it was protected by 7 destroyers. A pack of 4 U-boats attacked, and the Justicia was torpedoed by the lead sub and stopped dead in the waters. The destroyers responded with depth charges, but to no avail. The Justicia was now towed for the remainder of its voyage. The same U-boat attacked twice more without effect, but another U-boat joined the pack, and 17 more destroyers and other defense ships joined the convoy. In spite of this, a U-boat managed to torpedo and sink the Justicia. The Allies also had another big advantage, though. U-boats exchanged signals with radio stations, right? The one at Nauen was the home link most of the time, since it was the only radio with the range to transmit to North Africa or North America. But relying on wireless was a weakness, since the British, and to a lesser extent the French, had, unknown to the Germans, cracked their radio codes and could read their messages. The Germans used wireless communications for everything, including discussing their most secret plans. They had complete faith in their equipment. The problem was, even though they re-ciphered their code keys, they continued using old ciphers at the same time as the new ones, so the British could just compare them and figure out the new ones. They also found new code changes by diving on shallow U-boat wrecks or searching the wreckage of naval zeppelins. So German maritime radio was pretty much public communication. Before focusing on coastal U-boats, the Germans had begun a U-cruiser program. This came about after all the German surface cruisers had been sunk or captured by the Allies. But Germany had a large merchant sub that was trading with the US before the latter joined the war. After it did, that sub and 7 other merchant subs under construction were turned into U-cruisers, able to attack shipping off West Africa or the east coast of North America, a remarkable feat for subs of the time. However, their mission, to sink as much tonnage as possible, was impossibly large for such a small fleet. By 1918, though the main mission of the German U-boat fleet as a whole was to sink shipping in the war zone around Britain, its practical utility was to tie down Allied naval resources and force them to devote the majority of their strength to anti-submarine work. Winning the war by U-boat alone had been rendered impossible. In the end, Germany built or utilized 390 U-boats in the war. 178 of these had been lost. 515 officers and 4,894 crewmen had been killed. Despite their relative weaknesses, the submarines had proven themselves supremely seaworthy in rough weather and able to withstand crushing depths. They did not enjoy the steady stream of intelligence they would in World War II. And in general, the lack of central direction and communications made their hunting reliant upon advanced planning and luck, rather than a constant feed from a secure intelligence source. In the final act of the First German U-boat War, after the war on merchant shipping had been called off in October 1918, the undersea battle again became what it had been in 1914, a war focused on sinking Allied warships. On November 9th, UB-50 torpedoed and sank HMS Britannia off Cape Trafalgar. This was the final warship lost to submarine action of the Great War. By this time, the surface fleet had mutinied against high command, but beneath the seas, the U-boat commanders were both defiant and deadly, even in defeat. We'd like to thank Paul Hodos for the research for this episode. Paul also wrote a book about the U-Cruiser program. You can find a link in the video description. Now, as I said in the beginning, this episode was sponsored by War to Glory, a real-time strategy MMO browser game. Become the leader of the city, take care of its defense, and build your own army. Carefully choose your own tactics and strategy to be successful. If you want to learn more about War to Glory while also supporting this channel, follow the link in the video description.